purpose of this video is not to allocate blame to anyone, but to highlight the need for greater awareness amongst educators when it comes to trauma. There needs to be far better trauma-informed practices within the whole education sector, at the very least in schools in Florida, or at the very least in the school that Maddie was at. Because there are so many things here which, for me, with my professional background, which I prefer not to go into, I like to keep my own backgrounds, etc., private. But for me, there are so many things here that an individual with adequate training and knowledge should have seen as cause for concern. So in this video, I'm using audio from Grizzly True Crime. So shout out to G, you are a pure legend, and I so appreciate all the hard work you've done for Maddie's case. So the audio that I'm looking at today, and I'm going to actually look at several different educators, but in this audio I'm just listening to, in this video, I'm just listening to audio from Maddie's counsellor. Now, my first question in terms of terminology. In Australian schools, what you have allocated to schools is social workers. So these are trained professionals who have, I think, 4 or 5 years training specifically as social workers. So in Australia, when you talk about a counsellor, that is someone who has done it's not even a university degree, it's more of a TAFE course, which is probably 12 months or 2 years. It is not as extensive as social work, and certainly is not as skilled as social work. So I'm just wondering, in terms of schools in Florida, and if someone can help me out with this, someone from America can just bring me up to speed with this. When they talk about someone as a counsellor, does that mean that they are someone with those minimal qualifications, or are they actually someone with a social work degree or a psychology degree that has gone into the schools? Because you also, in Australian schools, do have psychologists that go in for referrals and things like that. So if anyone can just bring me up to speed there, just to give me a better understanding. But for the purpose of this video, I'm going to work on the presumption that in America, a counsellor is the same as in Australia, someone who has qualifications in counselling, but they don't have the same level of education and skills as, say, a social worker or a psychologist. Why does this matter, you ask? Well, to me, one of the things that comes out in terms of Maddie's case is that there needs to be more funding directed towards public schools in America that will allow for fully qualified social workers, at the very least, should be made available for students. People who have adequate skills and training, adequate knowledge, so as to be more than capable of trauma-informed practice. There needs to be people in schools who have the understanding of when a child is presenting with trauma symptoms, and who have the skills to follow up on those symptoms and make sure that whatever's going on in that child's life isn't going to result in that child coming to harm in the way that it did with Maddie. So let's listen to these excerpts from this particular interview with the counsellor from the school. And as we go through, I'm going to pause at various spots to just highlight some things that perhaps could have been better understood or could have been done in a different way.
So I met her at the beginning of this school year in an ESE meeting. She was being transferred over from 504, that she was under that in 6th grade with our 6th grade counselor, Miss Merritt.
Okay.
Transferring over at the beginning of this year to the ESE services with our ESE staffing specialist, Miss McGregor. So I was sitting in on that meeting. In that meeting, they approved that switch and she got switched over. I heard a little bit about her background in terms of having ADHD, a lot of problems with focus that affects her schoolwork and grades, and then some mental health concerns in terms of a lot of anxiety and panic attacks. So from there, I have been doing ongoing check-ins with her throughout the school year thus far. I think we've met about, I was looking at it earlier, 6 times.
Okay, since the beginning of the school year?
Correct.
Got it, okay.
When she has come to me, it's often been those feelings of panic. She's come to me like in the middle of class or during lunchtime just feeling really panicked, kind of heavy breathing, feeling really overwhelmed. And when we've had our conversations about, well, what's going on, what's making you feel this way, I've gotten responses saying, well, it's my anxiety, sometimes I don't know, I'm just really overstimulated with all the noise in the cafeteria. But I've also gotten responses with, well, things at home with her. And when I pressed about that, it seemed to be things along the lines of, well, she gets upset that I'm forgetful or that I don't clean my room the way she wants me to.
So there's a few things here that I want to address. So I like that they did have a meeting to sort of hand her over. I don't know what all the different letters mean in terms of their roles, what they do, but it sounds like they did at least have a meeting at the start of the year to hand her over to whatever group this person is part of, for them to take over keeping an eye on Maddie. And she's saying that she was having regular instances where she was touching base with Maddie. Now, my question here would be, how much time did she spend with Maddie in each of those instances? Were they just passing in the hallway and going, hey Maddie, how's it going at the moment? And getting, yeah, all good. Or, putting aside a quick 5 minutes in her office to say, hey, how are things with you? How are you going with your work? Because really, at the start of a relationship like this, it shouldn't even be discussing home life or school or whatever. Just finding out what makes her tick, making her feel like that is a safe space for her. And it sounds like she must have done that to some extent because Maddie was going to her when she was having panic attacks. So hopefully there was that happening and she was finding out more about Maddie as an individual and what Maddie liked, and having conversations about Maddie in choir and things like that. From this conversation, it's hard for me to tell if she was actually doing anything of the sort. So I would be questioning what these meetings were, these touching base with Maddie were, just to sort of find out how deep the relationship was. Now, here's the thing. A lot of the time, when it comes to trauma with children, the biggest time for them to have a trauma reaction is in the playground, in the cafeteria, or if a classroom is out of control, essentially. So for me, straight up, it causes red flags when she says that she comes to her feeling overwhelmed because of the cafeteria and because of the classroom. I would have wanted to know what instances in the classroom were triggering Maddie to go to her with a panic attack. Because I'd be almost willing to bet that those times when Maddie went to her with a panic attack were instances when the class was becoming particularly loud or unruly. And these are questions that need to be asked when a child is having a panic attack and needs to escape the classroom. This sense of overwhelm, is this because their whole fight and flight response has been triggered because suddenly they feel unsafe in that environment, meaning that there are perhaps people getting into her space, or people being too noisy, or yelling out, or out of their seats, or doing things that make her feel unsafe. Because to have her exiting the classroom every time she gets panicked, or going to the counsellor every time that she gets panicked in the cafeteria, is not making any progress for this child. So it should have been a case of establishing patterns and finding out when these things were occurring. And straight up to me, that would make me want to dig deeper into what's going on with this child, because they are straight up red flags to me. In terms of Maddie relaying that she becomes anxious and she has these panic attacks because her mum gets onto her about tidying her room or yells at her and everything, that's not... there's a major disparity there. That's not what I would expect from those reactions. And quite often what you're going to see is that the initial response from a child is what causes you panic, what causes you to feel upset, etc., is that they're going to think of another instance when they have felt that response. And clearly for Maddie, that response occurs when someone is being loud. So her relaying that her confrontations with her mother are behind the panic attacks should have been an indicator that no, that's actually not the cause of the panic attacks. That is another instance when the panic attacks are triggered as a response to overstimulation. So you've got 3 instances: the classroom, cafeteria, being yelled at by her mum, that trigger these panic attacks. And this is where someone with perhaps a bit more training should have recognised that there's more going on here, and should have been trying to find ways of connecting, making a deeper connection with this child, or referring the child to someone with better qualifications. So if there was a school psychologist, for example, referring them to them to find out a little bit more.
And we talked about what that does to affect her, and she says, yelling, that makes me get overstimulated, and then I can't respond to her in a way that she wants me to. So we discussed strategies for kind of calming herself down and talking. She's calm about how that makes her feel. And she reported to me that she did have that conversation for our past check-ins since December. So December, January, February, we had a check-in every single month, and each of those check-ins she had said to me, things are better at home and things are a little bit better at school, and I haven't had her come to me in months with any sort of panic or anxiety.
Okay, this makes me sad. Now, she's saying that she's spoken to Maddie, and Maddie was saying that things are so much better for her over the last couple of months. And later on, she does say that she's aware that Stearns had moved out. So you'd think that you would be making that connection there in terms of, okay, suddenly this child is performing so much better at school, she's so much happier, and this man has moved out. I think I need to investigate this situation a bit more. And here's the thing that makes me especially sad. And I think this is something that counsellors need to take into consideration, and counsellors, social workers, etc. need to be taught to understand this. It's all very well to say to a child, okay, so you get upset and you freeze up when your mother yells at you. So I'm going to teach you these strategies. I'm going to teach you how to speak up for yourself when you're calm and when that situation is not occurring, so that you can speak up at a separate occasion when the confrontation isn't occurring, to say how it makes you feel. On the surface, that is great advice. We do want to teach our kids to speak up for themselves. But here's the problem. If you're going to teach a kid that, okay, it's okay for you to speak up for yourself, you need to also teach them about trigger warnings. Because this one comment has worried me from the moment I heard it. Has she coached Maddie to speak up for herself and to say when she doesn't like things? And is that what happened the night that Maddie died? Did Maddie, having been coached to speak up for herself, turn around and say to Stearns, look, I don't like what happens and I don't want to do it anymore? Because we've heard that Stearns has a short fuse. And it's quite possible that had she said that, thinking that she was doing what her counsellor told her to do, that might have triggered Stearns, and that could have been the reason that she died. I hope not, and I certainly don't want to be allocating blame, but I just do want to highlight the fact that in terms of counselling children, when you know that something's not quite right at home, then before you start giving them tools such as choosing a time when someone is calm to essentially confront them over the issue, you need to make sure that that's not going to put them at risk in doing so. I'm not saying this did happen, I'm saying it is definitely a possibility.
I did have her mention on occasion her home situation. At that time was when I asked her about that. The only thing she really said was, I don't really like him. He's kind of weird. So I said, okay, well, what does that mean? How is he weird? Why don't you like him? And her responses were nothing of that level of concern. It was always, well, he eats all of our food and he hangs out in the living room and it makes me uncomfortable because I don't really like him, so I don't want him to be there. But nothing ever to the level of concern that we're seeing now. And the last thing I heard about him was he's moving out. I'm happy about that, and that's helping me feel better.
You have a child who is underperforming in school, a child who is struggling with panic attacks, anxiety, who is falling asleep in the classroom, and who is relaying that her home life is causing her distress. And now this counsellor is saying about her conversation with Maddie about Stearns, and she says a number of statements which, to me, when you look at the other things that are going on with Maddie, would make me want to question things. It would make me want to have a face-to-face interview with her mother, for starters, and then I would want someone with more qualifications to actually sit down and spend time really talking to Maddie, because there were so many red flags here. And it sounds to me that this counsellor just was not able to spot them. She just did not have the training to know what she was looking for. Now, one of the things she says is, Maddie mentioned that he eats all their food. Now, my question there would have been, does that mean that you sometimes don't have food in the house? Because that's important. If she says yes, then straight away that is something that needs to be referred to protective services. So when a child is saying he eats all our food, you do need to clarify that question. But if they're just saying that as a throwaway thing, and you prompt them and they're just like, oh no, I don't like it, a 12-year-old child isn't going to be hugely concerned over the cost of groceries. So unless he's stealing all the chocolates that she's got hidden away in her room, or something like that, then it shouldn't be so much of a concern for her. If it's just that he's eating food out of the cupboards, and he eats a lot, it's not costing her to put the food in the cupboards. So that's definitely something that should have been looked into further. But here's the thing. You have this child who's having panic attacks, and she makes repeated statements. And yes, the counsellor says, well, they were just throwaway statements, and she laughed about it. But she says, I don't really like him. He makes me feel uncomfortable. I don't want him to be there. And she was happy about him moving out. Now, if this child was not presenting with anything else that would make you suspect that this child has experienced some sort of trauma, then maybe you could accept them laughing it off. But because of everything else that was going on with Maddie, these should have been seen as red flags. These should have been something that prompted the counsellor to continue with this line of questioning. There are ways of getting more information about these sort of things out of children without making it in an interrogation. And like I said, if you don't have the skills to pursue it, then even if it's something where you don't immediately feel that it's reportable, then you refer it on, or you have a conversation with other staff within the school. Speak to the counsellor that spoke to her last year, that worked with her last year. Speak to other professionals in your field. Don't just let it rest. And I think it's sad that this counsellor seemed to have been working in isolation and somehow didn't recognise that there was an issue that needed to be dealt with.
She never mentioned wanting to harm herself or wanting to die. She made comments in the interactions where she was feeling panicky, saying things more so like, you know, this hurts and I don't like this or want to deal with this, but it was never anything like I want to hurt myself or end my life or anything along those lines.
This hurts. I don't like this or want to deal with this. That is more than just anxiety or panic attacks. And sadly, this counsellor didn't recognise that. This is another thing. These are statements that should have prompted further clarifying questions. Yes, you do have to be careful how you tackle it. And like I said, if you don't have the training or skills, then you need to refer it on to someone who does. But this was a cry for help. And sadly, it went on deaf ears because it sounds like this counsellor didn't have the skills to recognise what it was.
Did she mention anything about just didn't like him because he ate their food and he was in their living room? Like, did she say anything else to you, disclose anything to you?
She did not. She didn't talk about, asked her about those comments of him being weird and uncomfortable. The only things she gave me were, well, I don't know, he's just a little weird. He eats our food and he's always hanging out in the living room and I don't really want to be around him, and nothing. And the way she said it was so like joking in terms of like, I don't know, he's weird type situation, like laughing about it. It never made me feel like there was a safety concern.
What she's describing there is classic masking behaviour. Maddie was really self-conscious about something. She was hiding something right then and there. But unfortunately, the way the counsellor read it was, oh, it's just insignificant, she's laughing about it. If only she'd have realised that children will mask things when there are dark things happening. They will blame themselves at times. Then they know that there are things that they shouldn't say, or that they're expected not to say, basically, and they will mask because they know that it's going to cause them problems if they say things. This is a 12-year-old girl who had enough knowledge to know that what was going on with her wasn't right. By 12, she had to have known that. So her reaction there wasn't her laughing it off. That was her masking what was really going on.
Did you ever see her exhibit any of those behaviors, like that she is depressed, or that she, like, did you notice anything about her that was out of the ordinary other than the things we've already talked about?
It seemed more so to be very up and down.
Okay.
Like she would have those heightened moments of the panic and the crying, and just kind of, she would go from that to just like shutting down after the panic. And then if you talked her through it a little bit, like there's one specific instance in my statement that she could not say what was making her feel that way. And so I asked her to draw it out, and she was able to do that.
Okay.
And then she kind of put on there just like a lot of scribbles, which to her, she said that meant just like the chaos of all the feelings and thoughts that she's having that make her feel overwhelmed. And then words she wrote, so things along the lines of like why or crying and things like that. And
okay, when it comes to trauma, the body remembers. So sometimes there will be a reaction that has been triggered by something so tiny. It just could be a smell that will trigger a trauma reaction, a panic reaction, and that sense of being completely out of control. And then when you come back down from it, you might not know what triggered it. And you may just bury it down again. And that's what this counsellor has described with Maddie. Maddie has had a classic trauma reaction to something, where something has triggered her, and then she's shut it all away again and built that wall. And she's even said words, things like why, crying. She's written those words down. She's written scribbles showing the confusion in her head because she doesn't understand it. That is a classic trauma response. But it wasn't recognised as such. This was more than just a panic attack. And it was missed.
After that happened, I reached out that she wasn't at school for a couple days, so I was like concerned of, okay, we went from this to now being out, what is happening? I reached out, and at that point, he's been struggling lately, a lot of tears and feelings, but that she was seeing a weekly therapist.
Okay.
So she supposedly had someone that she was seeing weekly about all of this.
Okay.
And also stated at that point she hadn't been at school because she was sick and she was going to take her to the doctor that day. And she mentioned seeing the drawing that home from our conversation, and I, encouraged her to share that with Mom, so she did. And she said that she appreciated that and that helped her in that day, which at the end of that conversation with her, she was able to calm down and feel better. But at that point, that's when it got a little concerning, to the point that I reached out to Mom just to say, hey, what's going on? And found out, okay, she at least has supposedly weekly therapy sessions outside of school.
Okay, I know things are done slightly differently in the United States, and that this may have been considered a confidentiality issue. But, first of all, before I cover that, actually, I should say, her contacting Jen, when you actually read through the notes and stuff, she did so via the app that they use for communication. So it wasn't a one-on-one sit-down meeting with Jen, which I believe at that point in time should have occurred. Because then you can also read the body language of the parent, and that can give you cues. But not only that, when it is communicated via messages, you're only getting part of the information. If you're sitting down and doing a one-on-one conversation with the parent, then you can ask further questions. You can delve deeper and get more information. And you can steer the conversation to find out more. So it is a real shame that she didn't set up a meeting with Jen at this point in time and do a face-to-face interview with Jen about what was going on with Maddie. Now, going back to what I was going to say about in terms of confidentiality. So I find it interesting that she talks about how Jen has told her that Maddie was seeing a weekly therapist. But each time she says that, she says supposedly. So it's like she's not entirely convinced. And here's the thing that should have occurred here. And there are ways of broaching it that are, not being too intrusive. But my question would have been, can I please ask the name of the therapist so I can update it in Maddie's file? Simple question. You may get an answer, you may not. The follow-through also should have been, it would be beneficial for Maddie if we were to be able to work with her therapist so that we can take on board some of the suggestions that her therapist makes. Is it possible for us to arrange a meeting with her therapist, or for you to get a letter from her therapist giving us instructions that can help Maddie cope better at school? Because at the end of the day, first of all, that is always beneficial for the child. If they are seeing a therapist or a psychologist outside of school, then you want to all be working as a team, and that will help the child make progress. Otherwise, the child's just going to continue going along the same path. But the other thing that achieves is it's basically a bullshit meter. Pardon my English. What you're doing there is that there are some parents who will talk the talk. When things aren't quite right for their child, and perhaps things aren't quite right at home, if they don't want to admit when things are wrong at home, they will tell educators or counsellors or social workers what they think they want to hear. So it's always good to get verification. When you have concerns, when you are concerned enough that you are contacting the parent of a child and saying, I'm concerned because of this incident, then you need to verify what it is they are telling you. Particularly in this instance where Maddie had this incident and then was absent from school. There is a duty of care here that I believe was not met. And once again, I'm not saying that I blame the counsellor. I'm saying that there seems to be a lack of training here, a lack of understanding, a lack of knowledge of trauma-informed practice. And that's concerning.
And most of these things you said that would trigger these panic attacks or these anxiety-inducing issues were because of issues that were going on with them, correct? Like where she would argue with.
It seemed to be a combination of bringing that from home, the arguments and the feeling like she's taking on those feelings at home of, I don't feel safe in terms of not necessarily physically safe, but emotionally safe, that at me and causing me to feel overstimulated. And then I come to school and it's loud and there's lots of kids and I'm overstimulated again.
But it wasn't usually.
And things she said along the lines of, my room's not clean, or you forget to do this, or you don't do that. So to me, that's like things about it was never,
especially at that age, with the teenage age, you know.
Again, there's a major disparity here. She's talking about Maddie, talking about how getting upset because her room's not cleaned and getting yelled at and stuff like that. But then at the same time, she is describing Maddie having major panic attacks. You've got to be asking the question, what else is going on here? Because that is not enough to be causing a child to be having major panic attacks at school. If a parent is just yelling at the child, I shouldn't say just, but if the child is having arguments with their parent at home, the school becomes a safe place for them, where they are happy, or mostly happy, and they're not going to be having these trauma responses to overstimulation. But for Maddie, that wasn't the case. School was not a safe place for her. She was overstimulated at school. Noisy places, cafeteria, etc., were triggering a fight or flight response. There's so much more going on there. And sadly, this counsellor couldn't see that.
Grades have seemed stable. We've been working on, in our check-ins, kind of coming up with strategies because of her ADHD and in terms of getting her missing work in to bring up the grades. And she seemed to be making improvements with that since around December, when she started reporting things are better at home, at school.
Okay.
Our last check-in was February 6th, I believe, and at that point, she was very happy that day. I called her down just to do our check-in, and she said things are going really well. She feels really happy. Things are better. Things are better at school, and that was the last time we had a check-in. And she said that she used the strategies at home to talk about the when we're calm, let's talk about what it's like when we're not calm and how that makes us feel.
Gotcha.
She says she was able to successfully do that.
So she's recognised here that Maddie has said things have improved at home, and that Maddie is suddenly coping better at school. She's happier. And yet she hasn't made the connection there with what was going on with this child and the panic attacks. And suddenly she's not having panic attacks, and this male is no longer in the child's life. Why not make that connection? You know, even someone with just basic training should have seen that as something that was at least worth discussing with a colleague and saying, I have concerns over this. Why was she not pursuing the whole matter of, okay, things are better at home, let's talk about what makes things better at home, and ensuring that the situation was going to stay that way? Because with him off the scene, given the right opportunity, Maddie may have actually been willing to disclose information that she may not have disclosed before. And it may have been possible to put things in place to prevent him ever getting access to her again. But the questions clearly weren't asked. Now, like I said, this is not an attack on the counsellor. I believe that this is someone who just simply did not have the training or the knowledge to fully understand what it looked like when a child is presenting with trauma behaviours. And I think this is an area that needs to be addressed in schools, definitely in Florida, or at least, at the very least, in the school that Maddie was at. Because while there are still inadequate supports for children like Maddie, this is going to happen again. Now, I am going to do some follow-up videos to this, because there were also conversations had with some of Maddie's teachers, and there are a few things there that I also wanted to highlight in terms of suggestions for changes that could be made in schools that would help catch these problems. So thanks for listening. I know it's been a very long one, so thank you if you are still here. Please hit the like button. If you're new, please subscribe, and leave a comment below. What are your thoughts on what I've discussed here in this video?